Okay. Well, God bless everybody. Thank you for being here. Tonight, I want to go into the book of Jonah. And I've been particularly moved to go into the book of Jonah. It's got a lot of individual lessons, a lot of great lessons to learn. But one of the fabulous lessons is that you can't ever tell who's going to get saved, who's going to get born again, if we will speak boldly. And that's certainly what Jonah did. And I wanted to read you a news feed that came through my news feeds, and I get conservative news feeds. This kind of headline should be on every news media when you turn on the news. But anyway, this is from Papua New Guinea, and the headline is "Miraculous Signs and Massive Baptisms." This comes out of May of this year, the late May, 22nd of May of this year. The Papua New Guinea for Christ evangelistic series going on now in Papua New Guinea continues to astonish with reports of numbers baptized. Early estimates were that 98,000 people had been prepared to be baptized. But now a report from the General Conference and the president extrapolates that the number is far beyond that original estimate. So this is Ted Wilson. He's the president. He writes, "Praise be to God. The latest information from the South Pacific Division and the Papua New Guinea Union Mission is that 278,369 people have been baptized so far in Papua New Guinea for Christ, with only about 52% of the over 2,000 sites reporting. This is a miracle of God." So as we get near, I believe I could be wrong, but I believe we're near the return of Christ. And to me, here's Papua New Guinea, and I don't know what their original religion was or whatever, but if you're baptizing 278,000 people in a certain number of months, that's a miraculous move of God. And I'm blessed to see that on the face of the earth. Blessed to be able to read that to you. And that's kind of what happened in the book of Jonah. And frankly, I'd like that to happen in countries all over the world. And then I'd like Christ to come back. So I have a lot of things I'd like to have happen. But in any case, let's get into the book of Jonah. It starts out, "Now the word of Yahweh came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, 'Get up, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me.'" Verse 3, "But Jonah got up to flee to Tarshish, away from the presence of Yahweh." And so with that, let's go back and let's unpack what's going on here. First of all, it says, "Now the word of Yahweh came to Jonah, the son of Amittai." Do we know anything about him? Do we know when he lived? And the answer is yes, we do. We know, let's go to 2 Kings chapter 14. Oh, it's funny. I'm trying to use my mouse to reach over to my iPad. That's not going to work. Okay, so 2 Kings chapter 14, and in verse 23, it says, "In the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel." And this is an interesting time because there were two kings, one in Judah, one in Judah, the southern kingdom, Israel, the northern kingdom, and they were both named Joash. So if you're reading the book of Kings at this time period, you really got to pay attention to who's doing what in what kingdom. So in any case, it's the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah. Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, began to reign in Samaria, and he reigned for 41 years. And he did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. Verse 25, very important. "He restored the border of Israel from Lebo Hamath." Now, Lebo Hamath is at the far north of Israel. It's very close to Mount Hermon. So it's way north in Israel. It says, "to the Sea of the Arabah," and the Sea of the Arabah is the Dead Sea. So at this point, you have Jeroboam II, very powerful king, reigning 41 years, and he's marching and reclaiming the territory of Israel in the north, and he's actually kind of taking some of the territory of Judah in the south, expanding down to the Sea of the Arabah, that we know that the Dead Sea, according to the word of Yahweh, the God of Israel, that he spoke by his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, and that's who Jonah is, the son of Amittai, the prophet who was from Gath-hepher. And we know that Gath-hepher is in the Galilee. So we know that Jonah originated, that was his home, was the Galilee, just like Jesus Christ. His home was in Nazareth in the Galilee. So Jonah was also a prophet from the Galilee. And we know that he prophesied approximately the time of Jeroboam II. Jeroboam II, if our chronologies are correct, reigned from about 793 to 753. Now, those dates are going to become really, really important, because when you understand the history of the history of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel was attacked by Assyria and conquered by the Assyrians in 722. So if Jonah was prophesying early on in Jeroboam's reign, let's say about 780 BC, something like that, then he's got about 60-ish years when he's prophesying before Israel is destroyed by Assyria. So now let's go back to Jonah chapter 1. We'll make more sense of it now. The word of Yahweh came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, maybe perhaps about 780 BC, get up, go to Nineveh, that great city. And get up, by the way, we'll see that phrase come up several times in the book of Jonah. That is kind of a minor theme in the book of Jonah, and it works for our life. That's kind of a mini lesson. If you want to do anything from God, you got to get up and get going. And so God says, get up and go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. Well, Nineveh was the capital city of Assyria. And obviously, it was a very pagan nation. And so, from God's perspective, what pagan nation isn't doing wickedness in the eyes of God? I mean, you've got pagan nations all over the world. They're worshiping idols. They're doing human sacrifice. They're doing all my gosh, all the pagan stuff that they're doing, the sexual misbehavior and everything. You know, there's nations everywhere on the globe that are doing wickedness. God says, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it because they're so wicked. And then in response to that, Jonah got up to flee to Tarshish, away from the presence of Yahweh. Now, what did Jonah know that caused him to get up and flee and away from the presence of Yahweh? And that we'll talk about that in just a second too. And I want to bring up a map of the Near East. Okay, so what we have here is a map of the ancient Near East. Now down here, the little tiny, you can the Dead Sea, and above it you can just barely see the Sea of Galilee. Whoops, it's up here. There's the Sea of Galilee, and you see Syria is Damascus. So this is the ancient Near East about the time of Jonah. Well, no, I'm sorry. This predates Jonah, but it gives you a picture of what was going on. Now, from here, we want to go to 1 Kings chapter 14. Now, we were just in 2 Kings chapter 14, but we want to go to 1 Kings chapter 14. It says, verse 1, at that time, Abijah the son of Jeroboam became sick. Now, this is not Jeroboam II, who was alive at the time of Jonah. This is Jeroboam the first. He's the very first king of Israel, and he started reigning basically about a year after Solomon died. So this is the very first year, really, of the kingdom of Israel. And his son falls sick. So in verse 2, he sends his wife to Ahijah the prophet. And Ahijah was a true prophet of God. And if you look down to verse 15, Ahijah gives a prophecy. He says, for Yahweh will strike Israel as a reed is shaken in the water, and he will root up Israel out of this good land that he gave to their fathers, and will scatter them beyond the Euphrates River, because they have made their Asherah poles, making Yahweh angry. So here you have a prophecy from the very first, in the very first king's reign in Israel, that they turn to idols and they're going to be destroyed and they're going to be cast beyond the Euphrates River. Now, this prophecy of Ahijah here in 1 Kings 14 would be about 920. So it's going to be about 200 years till 722 before the Assyrians destroy Israel. So this prophecy is going to hang for about 200 years and be destroyed. But you've got this prophecy hanging out there that everybody knows about, that Israel is going to be destroyed. It's going to be carried beyond the river. Now, what did that mean to Jonah? So here's Jonah, and he's down here in the Galilee, and you can see on the map. So here's Jonah down here, and God says, go to Nineveh. Here's Nineveh. It's a 600-mile walk, by the way, if you want to map it out. It's 600 miles. So God says, go to Nineveh, that great city. Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. According to 2 Kings chapter 17, Assyria is the country that came and destroyed Israel. And interestingly enough, here's the river Euphrates. So Nineveh and Assyria are beyond the river Euphrates, and that's what Ahijah's prophecy was, that the northern kingdom of Israel was going to be destroyed and carried beyond the river. Well, they couldn't be destroyed by Damascus in Syria because they're not beyond the river. But here's Assyria. They're beyond the river. And so Jonah gets this word, go and speak to these Ninevites, and because they're wicked. And Jonah put 2 and 2 together. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay, so that should have stopped. So Jonah put 2 and 2 together and figured, oh my gosh, I'm going to go talk to the Ninevites, and they're going to get their act together, and then the Assyrians are going to come and destroy Israel. And Jonah loved Israel. He loved his people, just like, I'm a United States citizen. I love my country. There are people on this call from other countries. You love your country, and you should. And Jonah loved Israel, and he loved God's people. And he'd been prophesying there for years. And now all of a sudden he gets this word from God, go to Nineveh, and he's thinking, holy smokes, I'm going to go there and I'm going to preach, and then they're going to come and destroy my nation and fulfill the prophecy of Ahijah. And he says, I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to participate in the destruction of my country. Now, you and I, looking backwards, say, Jonah, really, your job as a prophet is to do what God says, whether you like it or not. But Jonah didn't feel that way. So back to Jonah chapter 1. And in Jonah chapter 1, he gets up, it says, to flee to Tarshish. Now, if you were looking at the map, you've got Israel, and if you go west across the Mediterranean Sea, first you go underneath what we call Turkey today, then you have to go past Greece, then you have to go past Rome, then you have to go past the French Riviera, and finally you get to Spain. So it was off the map from Jonah's perspective, and that's where he wanted to go. He wanted to go to Tarshish, and it says away from the presence of Yahweh. And that's something that, as modern Christians, that doesn't make much sense to us because we know that God is everywhere. But in biblical times, and if you actually just read the text of the Bible, God presents himself as being in one place or another. Like, for example, when God visited the Israelites, he came down on Mount Sinai. If you read Genesis chapter 11, the Tower of Babel record, God who's in heaven says to his divine council, let's go down now and see what they're doing down there. So it's like, what? You have to go down and see? But that's the way God presented himself. He presented himself as a God that was in different places. If you read Psalm 18, when God wants to go from one place to another, it says he jumps on cherubim and they fly. We know from Ezekiel chapter 1, he has a chariot that's driven by cherubim. So he gets on his chariot and the chariot ride along. You and I think, why would God need to do that? He's everywhere. But that's not the way they thought of him. And so here's Jonah, and he knows that God is in Israel, and he's living in his temple, and I'm going to leave, and I'm going to get away from him. So that's why it says in verse 3, Jonah got up to flee to Tarshish, away from the presence of Yahweh. He went down to Joppa. At that time in history, Joppa was the only port of Israel on the Mediterranean Sea. Today, there are two big ones, Joppa and also Caesarea Maritima, which was built by Herod the Great. But at that time, they only had Joppa. That was the only port. He went down to Joppa. He found a ship going to Tarshish. Probably found lots of ships, but none of them were going far enough away. So he paid its fare, went down to go into it, to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of Yahweh. Of course, God wants Jonah to do what he wants Jonah to do, so God's going to intervene. And this is something that we know from history that God doesn't always intervene, but we also know that he can intervene. And that's one of the reasons that our prayers are so important. When Romans 12:12 says, be faithful in prayer, we want to be faithful in prayer. When 1 Thessalonians says, pray without ceasing, we want to pray without ceasing. That's a great mini lesson here in the book of Jonah, that we keep praying. And here, because God can intervene, and in this case, God did. He hurled a great wind upon the sea. And that's going to be interesting because the word hurled is going to come up again as well. So Yahweh hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty storm on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Verse 5, then the mariners were afraid, and every man cried out to his God. And of course, it would be instinctive to cry out to your God, but one of the things that we need to know, background, that's going to help us here, and why the mariners were looking for a supernatural cause, our gods, what's going on here, what's happening, is because the weather, just like the weather in Israel, is very predictable. The weather on the eastern Mediterranean Sea is very predictable. If you go to Israel, it starts raining sometime in mid to late October, and it rains until mid or late April. And that's the rainy season, mid to late October to mid to late April. And after April, it quits raining, and it's not going to rain again until October. And it was the same thing with the weather on the eastern Mediterranean Sea. You had a season for sailing, and then you had a season for storms. And you just really didn't have storms in the season for sailing. And that's when the sailing had happened. And so here, the sailors, they would be going all the way to Spain at a time when they knew that sailing was safe on the Mediterranean. They didn't have the most seaworthy boats back then. And so all of a sudden, in this time period when they would have been certain that they would have had good sailing, here's this gigantic storm. So they immediately began to look for a spiritual cause for the storm. And so verse 5 says, every man cried out to his God. They threw the cargo into the ship to lighten the ship. Jonah had gone down into the innermost parts of the ship, but he was lying down and was fast asleep. Maybe because he wasn't worried, and maybe because he was just overtired. Who knows? Verse 6, so the captain came to him and said, what do you mean, you sleeper? Get up. And there's the second time we see get up here. And again, that becomes kind of a theme, that we need to get up and get doing what God wants. He says, get up, call on your God. Maybe God will take note of us so that we do not perish. And of course, he had picked up Jonah as the captain of the ship. He'd picked up Jonah in Israel. So he probably suspected that Jonah had a God from Israel. And so he says, call upon your God. Verse 7, and they said to one another, come, let's cast lots so that we know who's responsible for this evil that has come upon us. Because again, this was an untimely storm. They suspected that somebody was a problem. Sometimes casting lots obviously doesn't work, but in this case, God's going to be behind it. He's going to energize it, empower it. So they cast lots. Verse 7, so they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Verse 8, and they said to him, tell us now, on whose account this evil is upon us? What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? Of what people are you? And so they're trying to find out what he has possibly done, maybe in his past, what's going on that all of a sudden he's responsible for this storm. And so verse 9, he said to them, I'm a Hebrew, and I fear Yahweh, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. And that's a verse that we today can read over very quickly because it just makes sense to us. But it's really worth picking this verse apart and seeing what he's telling them. The first thing he does is he tells them his nationality. I'm a Hebrew, so they know he's not a Greek, he's not an Egyptian, he's not a Syrian. I'm a Hebrew, so they know he's from Israel. And I fear Yahweh, and that tells them because, even the Israelites were idolaters. They had different gods. So he said, I fear Yahweh. And then he says, the God of heaven. So this is the God whose major dwelling place is heaven. If you think, especially if you look at the Greek gods, the Roman gods, the Egyptian gods, the Syrian gods, you have gods that live on mountains. You have gods that live, in lakes like Poseidon. He lives in the water, So it was important that if these sailors didn't know Yahweh, he says, okay, I'm a Hebrew. I worship Yahweh. Yahweh lives in heaven. And he's telling them that. And then he says, who made the sea and the dry land? In other words, the creator of the earth, the sea and the dry land. And that was important for them to know. This is a very powerful God. You had some gods that all they did was like they did storms, like you had a storm god, or, Poseidon just ruled the sea, or you had Mars, which was a god who was over war. But here's Yahweh, who's made the heavens and the earth. So now he's introduced the sailors to this God that's extremely powerful, and he's made the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. Verse 10, then the men were exceedingly afraid because they realized that this was one seriously powerful God that Jonah had angered. And they said to him, what is this that you've done? I mean, they've already thrown their stuff off the ship. They've already lost a lot of money. He says, what is this that you've done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of Yahweh because he had told them. So this tells us there's a lot of dialogue going on that's not in the book of Jonah. What we read in the book of Jonah is just enough to give us the story. And verse 11, very logically, then they said to him, what should we do to you so that the sea will become calm for us? Because, the different gods required different kinds of sacrifices and offerings and that kind of thing. So they said, well, what do we do to you so that the sea will be calm? Because it says, for the sea was getting rougher and rougher. So he said to them, pick me up and throw me into the sea, then the sea will be calm for you. For I know that it is because of me that this great storm is upon you. So that was a mind blower. I mean, it's one thing to say, however, you've got to punish me or whatever to atone for my sin. But all of a sudden it's like, well, you've really got to kill me, throw me into the sea. And I love what happens next because, people, one of the reasons we want to witness is because most people in their heart of hearts are good somewhere there. And so many times we can reach them with love and logic and mercy and that kind of thing. Because, these men could have just said, oh, well, all right, if that's what we do, and just pitched him into the sea, and that would have been the end of it. But, these were sailors, but they were good men. So it says, nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get the ship back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more stormy against them. And by the way, when it says the men rowed hard to get the ship back to land, we have to realize that at this time period, most ships were fairly small, and the mariners didn't have the instrumentations to be able to, once they got out of sight of land, particularly, if it was during the daylight and the sun's in the middle of the sky and that kind of thing, they didn't really know which direction they were going. Today we have all these instruments, we know exactly what's going on and that kind of thing. In the ancient world, they didn't. And so generally they sailed in sight of land. As the boat would sail from one place to another, they would keep land in sight. And that's one of the reasons that Paul, if you remember 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he says, 5 times I was shipwrecked. You're like, my gosh, are you kidding me? Those guys must have been terrible sailors. How can you be shipwrecked 5 times? And the answer is, well, they kept their ships really close to land, and then there'd be hidden rocks. But that meant when the sea got tempestuous and Jonah says, throw me into the sea, the men, they can see the land. It's right there. Like, no, we're not going to throw you into the water. We're going to row like crazy and get you over to that land there. But of course, they couldn't do it because the sea was stormy against them, verse 13. So verse 14, then they cried out to Yahweh and said, please, Yahweh, do not let us die for this man's life, and do not hold against us innocent blood, for you, Yahweh, have done as it pleased you. And again, they understood that this storm was caused, a spiritual cause. Verse 15, so they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea stopped its raging. And of course, that would happen very quickly and would be a bona fide miracle that these people on the ship would witness. And then the men at that point were realized they'd been delivered. Their lives were genuinely in danger. And now with Jonah over the ship and the storm gone, their lives were saved and delivered. And I think that their response is beautiful here. It says, then the men feared Yahweh with great fear, and they sacrificed to Yahweh and vowed vows. And this verse then has a lot of emphasis because it's got a triple doublet. They feared with fear, they sacrificed to sacrifice, and they vowed vows. So if you're reading this in the text and you see the pressure in this verse, and I like the fact too that when the men were delivered, they had an immediate response. They were thankful. They feared Yahweh. They gave a sacrifice, and they vowed vows. We live in a time period today when I'd say, Westerners are not particularly thankful. We work all the time about, saying thank you, saying please, saying thank you, writing thank you notes, making sure people feel thanked for what they do. And here, these guys were delivered from the ocean. They feared Yahweh. They sacrificed to sacrifice, and they vowed vows. And we'll see that also when Jonah is delivered. Now, verse 17 says, now Yahweh had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now, we don't know what kind of sea creature this was, because in the ancient Greek, they didn't differentiate fish and seagoing mammals like whales and that kind of thing the way we do. We look at an ant in the ocean, and if it breathes oxygen, a whale or a porpoise, and if it's got gills, then it's a fish. But in both Hebrew and Greek, if the animal was little, it was one word, and if it was big, it was another word. So we just really don't know. In Greek, for example, the name of something big in the ocean is Kletos. Is it a whale shark or a great white shark, or is it a sperm whale? That kind of thing. So we do not have the ability from the ancient text to tell whether this was a fish or a whale. And then we have people that have studied, ichthyologists and people who study sea mammals and stuff, and they say, well, it might have been one of these or it might have been one of these, but frankly, there's not a lot of anything in the Mediterranean Sea that could swallow a person whole and then spit them up whole without them being chewed up or something. But the key here, I think, is verse 17 says Yahweh had prepared a great fish. So this could very easily be a one and only Jonah-eating fish, that God had worked to prepare this fish. All right, and things should be waking up. My iPad just woke up. So, all right, so chapter 2. Verse 1 says, and Jonah prayed to Yahweh his God out of the fish's belly. Now, what we know is that Jonah died inside the whale or inside the fish. And you're going to suffocate and die quite quickly. But we also know that you can stay alive for a few minutes. In fact, there are whaling records of the early whalers where One of the whalers would fall overboard. They'd send those little boats out, and they had a couple times where a whaler would fall overboard and be eaten alive by a sperm whale. The whalers would harpoon it, bring it on the boat, cut it open, and be able to revive the whaler. So when it says Jonah prayed to Yahweh his God out of the fish's belly, then we know that Jonah, as soon as he was eaten by the whale or the fish, immediately he started to pray, and then in just a very short time he would lose consciousness and die, and he was dead for 3 days and 3 nights. And so that's actually Matthew 12, verse 40, which says that, and there are 2 signs of Jonah in the Gospels, and one is in Matthew and one is in Luke. And if we go look at Matthew chapter 12 in verse 40, and Jesus Christ said, "For just as Jonah was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so will the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights." And we know that Jesus Christ was dead in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. And this says, "For as Jonah was, so will the Son of Man be." Jonah was dead, and the Son of Man was dead. And the reason that Jonah is a type of Christ is because he was dead for 3 days and 3 nights and raised, and Jesus was dead for 3 days and 3 nights and was raised. And so that's the first sign of the prophet Jonah. And so let's go back to Jonah chapter 2. And in Jonah chapter 2, we start in verse 2, and it says, "And he said," and now from verse 2 to verse 10, Jonah is, or 2 to verse 9, Jonah is recounting things that he remembered or thought when he was thrown over the side of the boat. This is verse 2 to verse 9 is not his prayer. And that's really important to understand, because it says in verse 1, he prayed, but verse 2 to verse 9 is not his prayer, but it's what he thought about his experience after the fish spit him up on the land and after God raised him from the dead. So verse 2, he says, "Out of the midst of my distress, I called to Yahweh, and he answered me." And how did Jonah know he answered? Because Jonah was alive. And that's how he knew. "Out of the belly of Sheol, I cried out, you heard my voice," and Sheol is the state of being dead. So he says, I was just about dead. I cried out, you heard my voice. Verse 3, "For you threw me into the depths, into the heart of the seas. The currents swirled around me." And of course, now he's recounting his experience of being in the water in the Mediterranean Sea. "All your breakers and your waves passed over me," because the storm was there, but it was abating. Verse 4, "So I said, I've been banished from your sight." And that's a great verse in support of the fact that when you die, you are dead. He doesn't, when he's thrown into the sea and he's about to be eaten by the fish, he says, "I've been banished from your sight." He's expecting to die. He doesn't say, "I'm going to heaven now." He says, "I'm going to be banished from your sight. I'm going to be dead." And then he says, "Yet I will look again toward your holy temple." And that's a great verse of hope, because sin does not keep you from being saved. That's a huge teaching. We learn that from all over the New Testament. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 is especially great on that. That that you can sin, you can lose your rewards, but you don't lose your salvation because of sin. David knew that in Psalm 51. Jonah knew that here. He's okay, I'm going to be dead. I'm going to be banished from your sight. It's kind of like when Job thought he was so sick and he was going to die, he prayed to God and he said, "You will look for me and I will not be." And that's exactly what would happen to Job. He wouldn't be dead, and he dead in every way. And here's Jonah. I'm going to die here in the sea. I'm going to be banished from your sight. I'm going to be gone and dead, but I will look again toward your holy temple, because he knew that God's a merciful God. He knew he was only running away to try to save his people Israel, and he knew God would raise him from the dead. So verse 5, he goes on, he says, "The waters surrounded me to the point of death. The deep was around me. The weeds were wrapped around my head. Of course, he's in the Mediterranean Sea. Verse 6, I went down to the bottoms of the mountains. The only way he knew that was because he understood that that's the way the fish would swim. The earth with its bars was around me forever. Then you brought up my life from the pit, O Yahweh, my God, in the pit. Number of places in the Bible that the word pit is used for the grave, and this is one of them. You brought my life up from the grave, O Yahweh, my God. Verse 7, when my life was ebbing away, I remembered Yahweh, and that's kind of an aha moment. You know, he's in the water, he's in the fish, his life is ebbing away, and he remembers Yahweh, meaning, boy, I really made a mistake here. I'm not God, Yahweh's God. And he says, I remembered Yahweh. My prayer came into you, into your holy temple. And he must have prayed something along the lines of, if you give me another chance, I will obey you. Something like that would be my guess. Verse 8, because he then follows up with, those who worship worthless idols forsake their own mercy. And that's really true. You know, we can confess Christ, believe in Christ, and be saved, or idols can't save. And that in our Christian witnessing, that's something that we need to remind people of and help them understand that God extends mercy, but idols and the devil don't. And verse 9, but I will, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. I will pay what I have vowed. When the sailors were delivered, they feared Yahweh, which would mean they'd thank and worship him. They said they did sacrifices and they did vows. Here's Jonah, same basic pattern. He's been delivered from death. I'm going to be thankful. I will sacrifice to you, and I will pay what I have vowed. Salvation belongs to Yahweh. Salvation there is doing double duty. It means physical deliverance and spiritual deliverance, physical life and everlasting life. Salvation belongs to Yahweh. Verse 10, I get a kick out of this, and Yahweh spoke to the fish. Yahweh knows all the languages, fish language, cow language, horse language, monkey language, you name an animal, and Yahweh knows the language. And Yahweh spoke to the fish, hey fish, and it vomited Jonah on the dry land. So here's Jonah, he's up on the dry land, and I don't know if you remember the map or not, but the fish obviously can't swim on shore, so it's going to spit Jonah up on the western shore, or the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea, the western shore of the land there. It's going to spit Jonah up, and then Jonah's, what's God say? The word of Yahweh came to Jonah the second time, saying, get up, here he is again, get up, go to Nineveh. Well, he's still got 400 miles to walk, which, it's like, okay. In other words, it's not like it, sometimes, I got a 15-minute drive to the grocery store or something. I mean, this is a 400-mile walk. Get up, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it the message that I give you. Verse 3, Jonah, smarter now, wiser now, Jonah got up and went to Nineveh according to the word of Yahweh. Now, this is the second sign of Jesus Christ. We read the first sign, Matthew 12:40, that Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights. If you look at Luke chapter 11, and in Luke chapter 11, and if we start in verse 29, it says, and when the multitudes were gathering together to him, he, and this is Jesus, began to say, this generation is an evil generation. It seeks after a sign, but no sign will be given it except the sign of Jonah. Verse 30, for just as Jonah became a sign to the Ninevites, so also will the Son of Man be to this generation. Verse 30 again, for as Jonah became a sign to the Ninevites. Now, Jonah had walked 400 miles to Nineveh. What did the Ninevites know about Jonah being inside a fish for 3 days and 3 nights? Nothing. And what if he'd walked into Nineveh and said, hey, guys, I was dead inside a fish for 3 days and 3 nights, and here I am? Nobody would have believed him. That wasn't the sign of Jonah. Jonah came from Israel. Israel, as you can tell, because the Assyrians went and conquered Israel, not soon after Jonah. I'm assuming that Jonah probably was dead by the time the Assyrians conquered Israel, but you couldn't prove that. But I think so, given the chronology. But so Jonah walks alone and unarmed into the capital city of an enemy nation and preaches and said, in 40 days, Nineveh is going to be overthrown. Now, that's amazing. That's incredibly gutsy. We talk about what we risk if we witness to people who don't believe that, they might get mad at us, they might yell at us, that kind of thing. I mean, it's astounding that Jonah survived. I mean, because he's, it's not like he's marching into Nineveh with an army. He walks into the city and threatens the city with being overthrown. And that's what Jesus Christ is saying. You want to know who I am? You want to know what I'm doing? Look at the sign of Jonah. Here I am. Here's Jesus Christ. Here I am among you. I'm alone. I'm unarmed. I'm telling you that, like he said, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, that kind of thing. He was in their face all the time. You have heard it said, and then he would say some law, the scribes or Pharisees, but I say to you, and it was the fact that he was in their face. He was according to their rules, not God's rules, but according to their rules, he was breaking the Sabbath. He was doing things like healing when he shouldn't have, and so they killed him. And he said, you know what kind of sign this generation in Galilee is going to have? The same kind of sign that the Ninevites had when Jonah walked into town. And the Ninevites, and then he makes this very interesting statement in verse 32, the men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and will condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And behold, someone greater than Jonah is here. He's like, the Ninevites repented when Jonah preached, but I'm here greater than Jonah. And my words just bounce off you like BBs. You don't care. You don't change. So he said, the men of Nineveh are going to judge this generation. So let's go back to Jonah chapter 2. So Jonah chapter 2, he was vomited. I'm sorry. Let's go to Jonah chapter 3. So God said, get up, go to Nineveh, that great city. Verse 3, so Jonah got up and went to Nineveh according to the word of Yahweh. Now Nineveh was an exceeding great city of a 3-day journey. Verse 4. And Nineveh was huge. And we'll see by Jonah chapter 4, God says there was at least 120,000 people there. So verse 4, Jonah began to enter into the city a day's walk, and he cried out and said, in 40 days, Nineveh will be overthrown. And the word overthrown here is a very hard word in Israel. It refers to when you burned your pancake and you turned it all the way over. So literally, it's not like Nineveh is going to go down easy. Whatever's going to happen to Nineveh is going to be a complete overturning. And that's the prophecy that he gave in Nineveh. Verse 5, and the people of Nineveh believed God, which is astounding. I mean, and that's what is happening in so many places in the world today. People who are atheists, people who've rejected God for generations, people who've been pagans are coming to Christ. But it takes witnesses. It takes people who are bold, who are willing to be there and speak and keep speaking and put up with all the people, the naysayers and deniers and people that call you religious. And what are some of the things they say? You're religious. You think you're better than everybody else. And that kind of stuff. And we just got to shrug that stuff off. That's going to happen. But the people of Nineveh believed God, and they proclaimed a fast and put on sackcloth. That's our equivalent of burlap. It's not comfortable. From the greatest of them, even to the least of them. Verse 6, and word reached the king of Nineveh. This is amazing. So some kind of runner comes into the king of Nineveh and says, there's this guy from Israel in your country. He's here in your capital city, and he's saying you and your country and your capital city are going to be overthrown in 40 days. And normally you would expect this king to send a few soldiers and they just kill him, and that'd be the end of it. But instead, it says the king got up from his throne, took off his royal robe, covered himself with burlap, and sat in ashes. That's the hope that you and I have to have when we witness to people that haven't believed. We witness into pagans, that kind of thing. People can change. The word of God can change people's hearts. And it did for the king. Verse 7, he made a proclamation and proclaimed through Nineveh by the decree of the king and his nobles, saying, let neither man nor animal, herd nor flock taste anything. Let them not feed nor drink water, but they must be covered with sackcloth, both man and animal, and let them cry out mightily to God. Yes, everyone must turn from his evil way and from the violence that's in his hand. Who knows? The God may turn. And it's nice that he says, the God. I mean, this was Israel's God. This wasn't their God. This was Israel's God. The God may turn and change his mind and turn away from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. Verse 10, when God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, then God changed his mind about the disaster he said he would do to them, and he didn't do it. And that's precisely correct. People can repent. We just have to be bold, keep speaking, and not be afraid that somehow or other we'll get offended or hurt or whatever. So now chapter 4, and I love this is so interesting, but it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was very angry. Why? Because he believed the prophecy of Ahijah. He believed that now Nineveh was poised to go and destroy his people. And if you understand how cruel the Assyrians were in warfare, they were monstrously cruel in warfare. And Jonah, right or wrong, felt responsible that this could happen to his people. And in fact, it did happen. The Assyrians got their act together here. And then very shortly thereafter put an army together, went and destroyed Israel. So he's very angry, prays to Yahweh and says, please, Yahweh, was this not what I said when I was still in my own country? That's why I hurried to flee to Tarshish. For I knew that you're a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger, and abundant in covenant faithfulness, and you change your mind about doing harm. So he says, I knew you'd change your mind, and so I ran. Verse 3, so now, Yahweh, please take my life from me, for it's better to me to die than to live. And the ellipsis here that you've got to understand is when he says that it's better for me to die than to live, what he's saying is it's better for me to die than to live and see what's going to happen to my country. And that's almost true, because what the Assyrians did to the Israelites is absolutely horrific. Much of it, or some of it anyway, caught on, immortalized on rock cuts. And then also from surface surveys of the Galilee and the areas of Israel, the Assyrian destruction of Israel was so complete, there really was only sparse population there after that for hundreds of years. I mean, the Assyrians took away so many people and devastated the cities that it's not like in 20, 30 years people moved back in. The devastation could be seen hundreds of years later. So verse 4, Yahweh says, is it right for you to be angry? And it's telling that Jonah doesn't answer him. He says, is it right for you to be angry? And Jonah doesn't answer because, Jonah now is in internal turmoil. And, people get this way. One of the things I love about Jonah is how honest it is about human feelings, because we know that God's God, but we have very human feelings about what God should do, and we get upset or confused if he isn't doing things. If you're sick or you have a loved one that's sick and you pray and they don't get better, and we're like, God, where are you? We wrestle with these things because we think, well, God's God and he should come down here and he should do this and he should do that. And we make these kind of things in our mind that God should do, and then we're upset or we're confused. A lot of times people, they wander away from the faith for a while because they just can't conceive of how God couldn't help them in that situation. But there's so many different things going on in the world, so many different players at play in the big, huge war between good and evil. God just can't always just snap his fingers and do what we would like or we would think that he should do. And so Jonah's not going to answer God here. Verse 5, he went out of the city, sat on the east side of the city, made himself a booth there and sat under it in the shade until he might see what would become of the city, because the prophecy was 40 days. Verse 6, Yahweh prepared a vine. Now here's God preparing again. So God prepared a great fish. Here he prepares a vine, made it to come up over Jonah so that it would provide shade for his head to deliver him from his discomfort. So Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the vine. So Jonah's really blessed about the vine. Verse 7, but God prepared a worm at dawn the next day, and it attacked the vine so that it withered. Verse 8, and when the sun arose, God prepared a scorching east wind. So east wind. So now he's prepared a fish, he's prepared a vine, he's prepared a worm, now he's prepared a wind. and the sun beat on Jonah's head so that he was faint, and he asked with all his soul to die, and said, it's better for me to die than to live. And God, who is the great lover and who goes first, and by the way, that's one of the things that we learn in loving people, is that people get their feelings hurt and that kind of thing. And even if you didn't do anything, it's always helpful if you go first. And God here, God's not at fault here. Jonah is the one who's mad, but it's God who moves. And he spoke to Jonah, is it right for you to be angry about the vine? And Jonah is so mad and so confused. And he says, I am right to be angry even to death about the vine. And what God's trying to do here is he's trying to say, Jonah, you're angry if I spare the Ninevites, but you're angry if I kill the vine. So it's not about sparing people and that kind of thing. It's not about killing. It's about whatever you want to happen. So what God's doing here by the vine and the worm thing is it's exactly the opposite of the Ninevites. Jonah wants the Ninevites to die and the vine to live. And God's trying to shake him up and get him to think about life logically and just kind of release and say, I'm not God. At some point, I've got to acknowledge the fact that I'm not God, and God must know what he's doing, even if it doesn't make any sense to me. So Yahweh speaks again, verse 10. Yahweh said, you've been concerned for the vine, for which you did not labor nor made it grow, which came up in a night and died in a night. It was a nothing. Verse 11, shouldn't I be concerned for Nineveh, that great city, in which are more than 120,000 persons who can't discern between their right hand and their left, and also much livestock? Jonah, there's more than 120,000 pagans who will die unsaved here if something isn't done. And you went in, and now, they know to believe and they know to turn from evil. So God's concerned about these people, and this, God's concern for the unsaved and the pagans has never changed. He's still got that concern. And so he says, there's more than 120,000 people there. They needed to hear the truth. And besides, there's a lot of livestock, and I don't know what was going on with the livestock. And then the book of Jonah just comes to an end. And then we're like, really? I mean, how does it really end? What happened to Jonah? We don't know. Did Jonah go back to Israel? We assume that he did. But we do know what happened to Nineveh. Nineveh got their political act together, got their internal struggles solved, and then marched across the Fertile Crescent, across the Euphrates River, head south, and then conquered Israel. So what Jonah was afraid of, and the reason he ran to Tarshish in the first place, did happen and is recorded in 2 Kings 17 and is recorded in 2 Chronicles. So we know. So that's Jonah. And again, if I take a 10,000 foot view, what I see is we have to maintain our faith when things are tough. God is right, even if there are things going on that we don't understand. And we've got to have compassion and love for the unsaved, because we never know. We could take the most unsaved, ungodly person, and all of a sudden they flip and believe in Christ and get saved. And we've got to continue to pray for open doors and speak to people and get people born again. So thank you for your attention tonight. Appreciate your putting up. We had a little bit of unstable internet, but we're marching forward, and appreciate your being here. And we